Пацани на нас.
Де ти? А, он летить.
Ага, дивись. Куди він буде летіти? А де не стріляй?
Та він не високо їде.
Ладно, є.
Йопті, блядь, уйобуй! Пацики, Япон.
A rapid spike in Ukrainian attacks deep within Russia is a sign that Kiev is running out of cards to play on the front line and is trying to remain relevant to its backers. Information analyst and publicist Sergei Poletaev has told RT News. Ukrainian media has touted the strikes, dubbed Operation Spiderweb, as historic and claimed it dealt serious damage to Russia's strategic aviation. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed the attacks, but stated that 3 out of 5 strikes were successfully repelled, causing no damage or casualties. The remaining 2 resulted in aircraft catching fire, which was quickly extinguished, according to the ministry, which also did not confirm the loss of any aircraft. Additionally, 2 brigades in Russian regions bordering Ukraine were blown up over the weekend. The damage caused by one blast derailed a passenger train, killed 7 people, and injured 71 others. The Russian Investigative Committee reported on Tuesday that both cases were terrorist attacks planned by Ukraine to maximize civilian casualties. The attacks were launched shortly before the second round of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul on Monday. Kiev has brought its last cards into play, Poletaev said, commenting on what he called unprecedented sabotage activities by Ukraine. A source in the Ukrainian Security Service, or the SBU, told CNN that the attack targeted the air bases of Olenia, Belaya, Ivanovo, and Yagilevo. The Russian Ministry of Defense later revealed that Ukranka Air Base was also among the targets of Operation Web, or Spiderweb, as it is called. According to Ukrainian media, the operation, which took 1.5 years to prepare, was overseen by President Volodymyr Zelensky and personally directed by SBU head Vasyl Malyuk. The SBU source who spoke to CNN said that the operation was extremely complicated from a logistical point of view, with the drones carried inside wooden mobile homes that had been carried into Russia on board trucks. Meanwhile, on the front lines of Ukraine, the Russian military has secured its most significant territorial gains in 6 months, liberating over 580 square kilometers in May of 2025 alone. This dramatic advance represents Moscow's most successful offensive push since November of 2024, as Ukrainian defenses show increasing signs of strain across multiple sectors of the front line. Rapidly expanding the security zone near the border, advancing in the Sumy region, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue successful offensive operations in different directions on the Donbass front lines. So today we will be discussing the unprecedented drone attack launched by Ukraine into Russia, dubbed Operation Spiderweb. We'll also be covering the front lines with a focus on the northern direction with the Russian incursion into the Sumy region. Now all that I ask is that you stick around to the end screen where you will get some bonus footage, and click on the membership trailer video in the end screen to see all the perks you get should you decide to support this channel with a membership subscription. Super thanks donations are also available, and let's get into it. RT News reports that Ukraine would not have been able to remotely attack strategic Russian aircraft parked deep inside Russian territory without direct intelligence and satellite support from the US, a former officer in the French military has claimed. Kiev's operation involved piloting FPV drones thousands of kilometers from the front lines. Guillaume Ancel, a writer and former French Army Lieutenant Colonel, told Le Monde on Wednesday. In quotations, "This is possible and conceivable only with the support of a powerful satellite communication system," he said. "Since the Ukrainians don't have this mastery, if they were able to act remotely, it's certainly thanks to the United States." Ansel suggested that Kiev would not have been able to carry out the operation without information from American intelligence. While some in the West have hailed Ukraine's latest drone operation, Stephanie Ordrand, an international risk consultant and reserve officer, has stressed that it would not actually have much of an impact. Despite its spectacular nature, Operation Spider's Web will not change the tactical balance of power on the ground or the course of the war because these weapons are not used on the battlefield, Ordrand told Le Monde. Throughout the Ukraine conflict, Moscow has described the hostilities as a Western proxy war against Russia and has condemned arms supplies to Kiev as counterproductive to the peace process. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also recently acknowledged the nature of the conflict, stating, in quotations, "Frankly, it is a proxy war between nuclear powers, the United States helping Ukraine, and of course, Russia."
Все, полетели. Началось.
Now on the front lines, Ukrainian media itself reported that during the last week of May, a negative trend on the front line is a decrease in the number of Russian attacks and losses, but an increase in the amount of territory that they have captured. The hottest areas on the front lines, they say, remain as usual across the northern border areas of Sumy and Kharkiv regions, as well as the Novopavlivka and Liman directions. In the northern fronts, Russian forces have significantly intensified pressure from the Kursk region toward the Sumy region. In fact, on the 29th of May, BBC Russian service reported that Russia was accumulating troops in the Sumy direction to create a buffer zone 10 kilometers deep, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said. He estimated that the number of the Russian group preparing for the offensive was more than 50,000 people. What can be the Kremlin's plans this time, and what are the prospects for the implementation? Asked the article. Some military experts also talk about preparations for the start of a major offensive of the Russian army in the Sumy and possible Kharkiv directions. On the 22nd of May, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced at a meeting with members of the government the decision to create a buffer security zone along the border with Ukraine to protect Russian regions from threats from the armed forces of Ukraine. This was not the first such statement by Vladimir Putin. For the first time, he spoke about plans to create a security zone along the Ukrainian border back in March of 2024. In May of the same year, the Russian offensive began in the Kharkiv region, and 3 months later, a retaliatory strike followed. The armed forces of Ukraine invaded the Kursk region. In theory, analysts say that such a buffer zone would narrow Ukraine's maneuver field, depriving them of the opportunity to carry out armed raids on the adjacent territory and strike it using tactical firearms, such as barrel artillery, small arms, and short-range drones. Buffer zones were formed by the border troops of the Soviet Union during the Afghan campaign. They operated in all northern provinces of Afghanistan at a depth of up to 100 kilometers from the border. However, in the case of the Russian-Ukrainian military conflict, there are few analogies with Afghanistan. It's not only about the geographical features and incomparability of the military capabilities of the detachments of the Afghan Mujahideen and the regular Ukrainian army, although that is also important. Soviet troops entered Afghanistan having met relatively weak, mostly focal resistance, and only later faced an exhausting and unexpected guerrilla war. There was no front line there. But there is one between Russia and Ukraine, even where there are no active hostilities now. You can call it a line of battle or confrontation. The essence does not change. Troops on both sides of the border are in full combat readiness. This means that in order to create a full-fledged buffer zone along the border with Ukraine, the Russian army, at least, needs to push this front line away. That is, to conduct a large-scale offensive operation. The length of the Russian borders with the northern regions of Ukraine is, in the Bryansk region, more than 350 kilometers, in the Kursk region, about 245 kilometers, in the Belgorod region, about 540 kilometers. However, half of the Belgorod section of the border with Luhansk and partly Kharkiv region is under the control of Russia. That is, 800 to 900 kilometers of state border remain under the control of Ukraine. The Russian army has a lot of troops in this section of the front. Two of its groups, west and north, are fighting in the Kharkiv region, in the Kupiansk direction, and in the area of Vovchansk. But the situation is relatively stable, and therefore, the forces of the parties are approximately equal, and sudden changes should not be expected in the near future. Of interest is the Kursk group, which have solved the task of displacing the armed forces of Ukraine from the Sudzha district of the region, and is considering relatively free. It is these units that are now trying to attack in the Sumy direction. According to the Ukrainian military expert Konstantin Mashavets, the reliable indicators of the number of the Kursk group of Russian troops are 75,000 soldiers. In quotations, in fact, in the Sumy direction, in terms of numbers and staff, there is an enemy combined arms army, reinforced by joint tactical groups of the airborne forces and marines, he writes. At the same time, the staffing of military equipment for such a combination of troops, according to his data, is quite low. Of tanks, no more than 160 units, possibly up to 200 units. Armored combat vehicles, no more than 480, although there is an indicator of up to 620 units. Barrel artillery, including 120mm mortars, about 660. Rocket artillery, up to 160 to 180 units. Even if the Ukrainian expert slightly underestimates the size of the Russian group, it is obvious that it is clearly not enough to carry out large-scale combined arms operations on the 800-kilometer front line. 100 people and less than one gun per kilometer. In the conditions of the Russian-Ukrainian war, it is difficult even to defend yourself with such forces. It should also be taken into account that the group of troops of the armed forces of Ukraine, after the retreat from the Kursk region, also did not go anywhere. Some of its units continue to hold small sections of Russian territory south-southwest Sudzha and near the village of Tyorkino, and also tried to attack the territory of the neighboring Belgorod region.
Стой, 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 стой. У него кольцо, блядь, здесь нахуй торчит.
Now, during the last week of May, Ukrainian mappers reported that the Russians' main task is to create the zone of pressure and distraction for the defense forces so that Ukraine cannot redeploy additional resources to Donetsk. Moving along riverbeds, the Russians continued their advance and pushed a few more kilometers from Basivka to Lokhnia. The fighting was currently ongoing this past week. The Russians captured Bilovody and continued advancing toward Yablonivka, and also broke through 1.5 kilometers from Veselivka and started battles for the village of Vodolahi. At the same time, the Russian armed forces moving along the roads began assaulting two more border villages, Volodymivka and Kostiantynivka. Their overall advance in different areas ranges from 5 to 10 kilometers. The Russian troops' tactical goal is to reach and occupy dominant heights to expand their fire capabilities. Consequently, they aim to take Yunakivka and Khotin. However, this is exactly where they will face significant difficulties, as the Ukrainian armed forces have already secured more advantageous positions on the heights along Yunakivka, Yablonivka, and Novo Nikolaivka, and do not plan to retreat easily. Another direct road to Sumy runs from the border village of Tyorkino through the already evacuated Bilopilia. The Russian forces also planned to advance from here, but their plans were disrupted by the Ukrainian armed forces a month ago, when they themselves launched an operation near Tyorkino, as well as several other places further east along the border. Most likely, the military campaign in the Sumy region will resemble last year's similar attempt to break through near Vovchansk in northern Kharkiv region, where Russian troops also advanced 5 to 7 kilometers but got stuck for a year. By the way, during April to May, the Russians were active on this part of the front as well, trying to bypass Vovchansk from two flanks. Recently, they managed to advance several hundred meters along the border near the village of Tai. About 70 kilometers east, near the border and along the Oskil River, the Russians have been trying for over 6 months to establish a new bridgehead and advance westward behind Kupiansk. So far, they have managed to cross infantry across the river, but without heavy equipment. which is why their progress remains slow. This week, the Russians captured a few hundred more meters near the village of Kamyanka and attempted to break through the border toward Stroivka, but the Ukrainian Defense Forces claim that they repelled the attack.
Чё, блядь? This